Buonasera e benvenuti all'Istituto Svedese di Studi Classici a Roma. Io sono Hampus Olsson e sono assistente scientifico di archeologia classica qui all'Istituto. Questa serie di conferenze in etruscologia, il salotto etrusco, è tenuto sia in lingua inglese che in italiano. E visto che il seminario di stasera va tenuto in lingua inglese, cambio anch'io ora in lingua in inglese. Good evening and welcome everybody to the Swedish Institute of Classical Studies in Rome. My name is Hampus Olsson and I'm senior lecturer in classical archaeology here at the Institute. We are very happy to have with us tonight Dr. Martina Piperno of the University of Rome La Sapienza, where she is assistant professor in Italian contemporary literature. Dr. Piperno has also been active in many other universities all over Europe. She has been assistant professor in Italian studies at Durham University, senior postdoc at the Catholic University of Leuven, postdoc at the Irish Research Council, and early career fellow at the University of Warwick, where she also earned her PhD. A decorated author, Dr. Piperno was the 2019 Scaglione Prize winner for her book Rebuilding Post-Revolutionary Italy. And Dr. Piperno is also the author or co-author of several other books, two of which I have with me here tonight. Modern Etruscans, Close Encounters with a Distant Past, and L'antichità crudele, Etruschi e Italici nella letteratura italiana del Novecento. One of the main focus points of the research of Dr. Piperno is the reception of ancient cultures and peoples, like the Etruscans and Samnites and other Italic peoples, and how their memory have been narrated and perceived in 18th, 19th, and 20th century literature. But also how these compare to other marginalized peoples of the ancient world, like the Jewish people. The theme of tonight's lecture connects to this and the usage of Etruscan as a metaphor in modern texts and movies dealing with the memory of the Holocaust. And with these words, I would like to leave the floor to Dr. Martina Piperno. Ancient Etruscans, Modern Jews, Disappearance and Memory. Welcome.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. It's a huge honor to be here and to be lecturing in a series at this prestigious institute. I'm really, really honored, and I'm really glad that you're all here, also in a very rainy day in Rome when the bus just don't work. Also, I'm glad to be here as part of a series of lectures on Etruscan studies, but I'm not in any way an Etruscologist. As has been said, I am a scholar of Italian contemporary literature, a modernist, and I have been dealing in the last few years, as has been said, and thank you for your introduction, Hampus, about the reception of ancient cultures, mostly in Italian, but also European, modern contemporary literature. The Etruscans are like 95% of my corpus. I'm not entirely sure why, but yes, that's how it works. Probably because I focus most, for professional reasons, on Italian sources. So, as has been said also by other scholars such as Sam Solecki, author of this recent book, the story of the disappearance of the Etruscans has provided us with a mystery story with nearly countless revelations over the century. Basically, a millennia-long detective story with hints and discoveries scattered throughout the centuries. And part of my work has been to detect the cultural movements of part of these discoveries, of these revelations about the mystery of the Etruscan people. Italian modern artists, among European Western artists in general, have increasingly expressed a sort of anxiety about the loss and the perceived betrayal of the ancient Etruscans and other pre-Roman peoples that is visible throughout history since the start of late 18th, early 19th century Etruscologia, and through the Risorgimento to modern poets such as Carducci, for example, and D'Annunzio, up to date. And this movie, L'Etrusco uccide ancora, The Etruscan Kills Again, is also a striking example of how the horror genre, the mode of horror cinema in this case, but also horror literature, can convey this sense of uneasiness about something traumatic, something violent that happened centuries before us, and somehow it's still unresolved and might evoke creatures or revenants that might come back to us to get some sort of revenge. So throughout history, mostly Italian writers have dealt with the Etruscan and pre-Roman cultures as something that belonged to them. Writing about the Etruscans, about the Samnites, about the Umbri, about all the other pre-Roman peoples was about defining what Italian culture was, Italian roots were, the Italian nation, where does it come from, when does it start. This changes a little bit after World War II, or at least a new paradigm emerges. Because as an example of a non-indigenous people, which was somehow besieged and defeated by the ancient Romans, and then mysteriously disappeared, maybe violently, I'm talking about non-specialist culture, obviously. I'm not talking about specialist discoveries about the Etruscans, but common knowledge about the Etruscans. Then modern Italian artists and their imagination started using that sort of primordial disappearance of an entire people as a metaphor to channel somehow the trauma of the genocide of Italian Jews, of the Jews in general, but specifically in the Italian context after World War II. So this is a new paradigm, at least for my research. The Etruscan heritage has no longer necessarily to do with Italianness, but it becomes a representation of something other. Of course, this is not new. The Etruscans have been added by as early as Latin and Roman sources, as you know much better than I do. But it is of course something relatively new for the post-World War II Italian literature and culture more generally, that at least that several authors have used Etruscan setting, objects, symbols, and places to express the trauma of the Shoah. I'm going to focus today on two works, one book and one movie, possibly one inspired by the other, that have this characteristic, that they use the Etruscan materials to convey the idea of the Shoah and the disappearance of the Jews. The first is Il giardino dei Finzi-Contini, The Garden of the Finzi-Continis by Giorgio Bassani. These works are not just generically inspired by some place or site archaeologically important, but actually are deeply invested in embedding important shades of meaning in their use of archaeological settings, as well as directly influenced by the latest news about recent discoveries in Etruria. So the Garden of the Finzi-Contini, il Giardino dei Finzi-Contini, by Giorgio Bassani, is a very important book for Italian literature. Not only because it's one of the most popular literary accounts of the Holocaust, but also because it is one of the first examples in Italian literature of a literature of memory that does not just repeat an autobiographical, that does not just use an autobiographical form, but introduces some elements of invention. So this is one of the first novels on the Shoah, not just an autobiography set that tells about the Shoah. So still very much based on Giorgio Bassani's own experience, the book tells us the story of the Finzi-Contini family and their friends sharing the Finzi-Contini private tennis court when the group was excluded from other sport facilities following the issue of the Italian racial laws. In fact, the Finzi-Contini family and their friends are Jews, so they cannot any longer use the public sport facilities after September 1938. It is a story about the premonition of a disaster, of exclusion and marginalization, and also an unhappy love story between Nicole Finzi-Contini, the blonde girl in the center, and the main film character, and Giorgio, a semi-autobiographical narrator. This is the poster of the Vittorio De Sica's movie, which was inspired by Bassani's book. I will not talk about this movie today because it doesn't feature anything Etruscan, but it is still a good movie. So the main body of the story is set in 1938-1939. But it is preceded by a short prologue happening in spring 1957, so after the war and several years after the main events. This prologue has the function of telling us why the narrator decided to write about the Finzi-Contini family and their disappearance in the gas chamber at Auschwitz. Let's have a look at how the prologue is structured. Because the very idea that the narrator tells us of writing this story, this tragic and extremely important story, came to him in the Etruscan necropolis of Cerveteri near Rome, a place that you definitely know. So let's have a look at how it works. Imagine it's spring, it's 1957, it's the economic boom, everything is going right. The horrors of the world are way behind us. It's spring, it's Sunday, it's the weekend. A group of friends with young families leave Rome by car, this is also important, in search of some recreation. They travel along the Via Aurelia, an ancient Roman road, which is now the classic pathway for citizens going to the seaside in the summer or in the weekend. They reach the coast, more or less around Santa Marinella, which is in the far left corner. There is the coast. They wander a little bit, but the weather is not very nice. It's windy, it's stormy, it's unpleasant, so they decide to come back to Rome. They take their way back to the capital city until they change their mind another time. They find a sign similar to this. This is the modern one, of course. And one of the drivers, there are a couple of cars, signals to the other one, please turn left, turn left. They are now going to the Etruscan necropolis. So from a lightweight weekend atmosphere, the characters are suddenly transported to a place of history, memory, and mourning. This change among this group of characters is the narrator, the one who's going to tell the story of the Finzi-Contini family and their disappearance. This change is reflected in the change of mood of one of the youngest travelers, a child, Giannina, who is 9 years of age, who asks, "Where are we going?" "We are going to see some Etruscan tombs," says her father, to which Giannina, remembering what she learned at school, says, "Papa, what do you think are the oldest, the Etruscans or the Jews?" "Try asking that gentleman," says the father. So not only we now know that the narrative I is a Jew, a crucial piece of information, but still a vague, evocative comparison between those ancient peoples, the Jews and the Etruscans, is established by Giannina. But it does not end here, because Giannina has further questions. "Papa, why are old tombs less sad than new ones?" "Well," answered the father. The recent dead are closer to us, and it makes sense that we care more about them. The Etruscans, they've been dead such a long time, is as though they'd never lived, as though they were always dead. But now that you say that, it makes me think, says Giannina, that the Etruscans really did live, and that they care about them just as much as about the others. In Italian is voglio bene agli Etruschi. The whole visit to the necropolis that followed was infused by the extraordinary tenderness of this remark. So an affectionate, a gentle, a kind, affectionate link between the characters and the Etruscan is established by the young child imagination. So during this tender and melancholic wandering through the Etruscan tombs of Cerveteri, which I will examine in further detail later, the narrator starts thinking about other tombs, and particularly the half-empty family tomb of the Finzi-Contini, back in his homeland of Ferrara in the northeast of Italy. And the majority of the members of the family disappeared at Auschwitz, and, I quote, "who knows whether they have any grave at all," wonders the narrator. So this is how the novel begins. This is how one of the most important Italian novels about the Shoah begins, in an Etruscan necropolis, and its evocative nature. So this, for the moment, is all for Bassani. Fast forward to 1965, Sandra, in Italian, Vaghe stelle dell'Orsa. A movie by internationally acclaimed and super famous director Luchino Visconti, the one of the Gattopardo, the Leopard, and Rocco and His Brothers, and many others capital Italian movies. Sandra, Vaghe stelle dell'Orsa, is not his most famous movie, but still won the Leone d'Oro Prize at Venice in 1966. I'm stating awards and prize and accolades just because I want you to know that these things were very much out there. People knew about them at the time. And also this movie makes the same, uses again the Etruscan objects, Etruscan setting, an Etruscan atmosphere to tell a story that has to do with the Shoah. Even if the poster doesn't really show that. The movie is indeed about Sandra, Claudia Cardinale, the actress, a half-Jewish woman who travels back to her hometown, the Etruscan city of Volterra, to take care of the inauguration of a funerary monument dedicated to the memory of her father, Emanuele Luzzatto, deported and assassinated at Auschwitz. During her stay, phantoms from her past emerge from the family home. The suspect that Sandra's father was betrayed, again betrayal, by his wife and by her fascist lover, to whom she is now married. The suspect never clarified that Sandra and her brother Gianni, the one in the center, were incestuous when they were younger, and that still Sandra is the object of Gianni's sexual desire. All this unfolds in the crumbling, uncanny setting of Volterra, among relics of the Etruscan past and among howling, incessant winds. A dramatic escalation of tension culminates, spoiler alert, in Gianni's suicide. His body is found while a funerary song in Hebrew is sung at the inauguration of his father's memorial statue. So it is possible that this movie is inspired by Bassani's novel. They have several elements in common. For example, the elements of mystery. We don't really know if Gianni and Sandra were actually incestuous in the movie. We only get hints about it. We don't know if Nicole Finzi-Contini, after rejecting the narrator, accept the courtship of another character in the book. The movie is way more explicit in this sense. We don't know. We just have a feeling that she might have some incestuous thoughts about her brother, Alberto Finzi-Contini. But not everything is explained in both Bassani's novel and Visconti's movie. Even the picture chosen for the international marketing of the movie, the Italian one is different, chosen from some version exposing Claudia Cardinale's half-naked body lying on her bed, might echo in a more explicit and sexy manner the subtle book cover of the first edition of Bassani's novel, which you have here, featuring Nicolas de Staël, Nu couché bleu. But it's also possible that Sandra's posture mimics actually the many female bodies lying down over example of Etruscan funerary art, and which are very much represented also in the movie, as I'm going to show you in a moment. The two works also have in common the theme of the journey, the transfer back to the homeland to tackle a difficult and challenging heritage from the past. Sandra makes a pilgrimage to Auschwitz and then back to her hometown of Volterra, while the narrator of Bassani's book has a pilgrimage from Cerveteri to the garden of Ferrara. And of course, Visconti might have taken from Bassani the idea of using the allure of the Etruscan place, Volterra, and to weave it to the recent history of the Jews, weaving its story to the history of the 20th century and to the Shoah. What do the references to the Etruscan word mean in both works? How does this relate to this Jewish memorial theme that they both articulate? Let's have a look at how the movie begins. The movie starts in a city, Geneva, Switzerland, during a party attended by international and glamorous people speaking at least 3 languages. We found the characters in a chic, elegant, urban environment and in a state of recreation. And also notice the clothing and Sandra's hair. She's the one standing, which probably is a wig, and her hair is gonna change in a moment very dramatically. So this only lasts a few minutes because we're immediately told by Sandra herself that they are just about to leave because they have to take care of the inauguration of her father's funerary monument back in the hometown of Volterra. So immediately, while the film credits go on and on and on, and with music, we are transported through a long sequence across Switzerland, then across the Alps, and then further south up to Tuscany, up to on one sign, this time turn left, direction Florence Signa, direction Volterra. We follow Andrew and Sandra. Andrew is Sandra's American husband, as they drive their convertible BMW, apparently Visconti's own car, through the Tuscan countryside to the top of the Balse, the cliffs that characterize the dramatic landscape of Volterra and its Etruscan walls. A sequence that, of course, shares a lot with the structure of Bassani's prologue, the journey by car, the use of the windshield, the road, and so on. The change of place from a modern apartment in Switzerland to Sandra's ancestral house proposes a contraposition between the modern world and archaic world, which is also present in Bassani. So the structure of the prologue of the movie, if we want to call it, the first minutes of the movie, is very similar to the prologue to the novel. The characters are depicted while they transition from leisure and release to memorial and family duties. And they physically move by car, a sign of their relatively wealthy state, as well of the times we're living. Again, that's the economic boom. Everyone has a car. Most people have a 500. And of course, it's a symbol of the optimism of forward-looking post-war Italy. We are moving from a city, in one case Rome, the other case Geneva, Switzerland, to a mysterious Italian province full of secrets, which inspires painful recollections and calls to the duty of testimony. As far as the use of the Etruscan settings, there are similarities and differences. In Bassani, we have a relatively circumscribed space. The suburban cemetery, this is how he calls it, of Cerveteri, is used to recall the seclusion and the relative isolation of both the mansion of the Finzi-Contini family, who didn't like to mingle with other people, and of their empty tombs in the Jewish cemetery of Ferrara. During their archaeological stroll, the characters of the prologue, like modern Orfei, descend, catabasis, in a specific tomb, the Tomba dei Rilievi, tomb of reliefs, to appreciate how the Matunas family, just like the Finzi-Contini, had obsessively prepared their second home for the afterlife as a reassuring, comfortable place. The tomb, which you can still visit today, still conserves every day dear habitual objects carrying sign of use, hunting and artisanal tools which may suggest a comparison with the everyday objects that victims left behind in concentration camps. Those that, for example, are exposed at the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and are now part of mass culture. The objects that are laid out in the Etruscan tomb are firstly functional and assertive and affirm the Matunas family's will to domesticate a hostile environment, yet their collocation in a tomb, deprived of their original function, suggests a sense of surrender. Indeed, the Etruscans that Bassani fantasizes about are not exactly warriors. They are abandoned, resigned, certain of having reached the end of their once powerful civilization. I quote, "The world was not what it once was, when Etruria, with its confederation of free aristocratic city-states, dominated almost the entire Italic peninsula. New civilization, cruder and less aristocratic, but also stronger and more warlike, by this stage held the field. But in the end, what did it matter?" In the space of a 2-hour film, Visconti has, of course, more space to exploit the figurative and symbolic potential of Volterra and uses several different places within the small town. The Balze, for example, the cliffs that swallow buildings and monuments, including the ancient Etruscan wall. Palazzo Inghirami, which once belonged to a famous Etruscologist. The Roman tank, where the two brothers, maybe lovers, descend, again, catabasis, to have an intimate and perhaps scandalous encounter. Even the Guarnacci Museum, the 18th century extraordinary collection of Etruscan artifacts owned by Etruscologist Mario Guarnacci, is used in this scene. The Etruscan urns are silent witnesses of a confrontation between Andrew, again, Sandra's husband, and Gilardini, the fascist lover of Sandra's mother, and they seem to know something that the characters don't know. An Etruscan vase is used by the two brothers, Sandra and Gianni, to exchange secret messages, again amplifying the theme of secrecy. Finally, the whole characterization of Sandra, as has been amply demonstrated by Maurizio Rari, is based on the stereotype of the ancient Etruscan women as independent, lustful, and lascivious, a stereotype based on misinterpretation of the tradition of the sacred prostitution among the Etruscans. Sandra is not only extremely sexy, independent, and mysterious, but also her hair, makeup, and jewelry directly recall the representation of Etruscan women. In particular, the braid has been singled out by Harari as an archaic and rustic hairdo that references several ancient Etruscan styles and contrasts the fashionable long bob. Do you remember the wig at the beginning? Perhaps a wig that Sandra sports during the party at Geneva. Sandra's sensuality also informs her movements around the house, for example here, when she caresses some artifacts in alabaster, a manufacture typical of Volterra since the Etruscan age. And these Etruscan features that make Sandra look like a timeless feminine archetype intertwine and enhance the stereotype of the beautiful Jewess, which is modeled on the biblical archetype of Salome, the Jewish princess, the beautiful, voluptuous, and dark-haired infidel, which is supposed to challenge the Christian morality with her looks and perceived lawlessness. Indeed, her husband Andrew, a non-Jewish male, leaves Volterra as soon as suspicions on the incestuous relationship between Sandra and Gianni arise. So, as you can see from closer analysis, the meanings that are associated to the Etruscan archaeology in the two works are rather different. Something they do have in common is the conjunction of the Etruscan setting with a story about victims of the Shoah, one more direct, one less direct. Both Bassani and Visconti associate Jews and Etruscans as ancient, ethnically defined communities, something in somehow identifiable and somehow detachable from the main body of Italianness, whatever this may mean, and in the case of the Jews, singled out by recent criminal laws. The Jews and the Etruscans are both non-indigenous peoples and migrants, and also proximal, familiar, but at the same time heteroctonous, non-autochthonous, having reached the peninsula centuries ago through a migration from the Middle East, and maybe, according to some sources, both peoples perhaps may be Semitic, who knows. Having been a part of Italian society or landscape in the case of the Etruscans, for centuries. They are both familiar and stranger to the norm, the average of Catholic, white, Western Italian society. Seen from the outside, they are peoples and cultures that have always been there, but in the end, they speak different languages and have a specific and perhaps specific customs and religion. The Jews-Etruscan parallel also plays with the idea that the Etruscans were object of a persecution that has something to do with the genocide of modern Jews in Nazi-fascist Europe. And while this is historically incorrect for the Etruscans, the feeling of a community betrayed by history, marginalized and silenced by a more powerful force is very common in the emotional experience of visiting an Etruscan place. Bassani particularly informs us carefully that while fantasizing about the Etruscans, he had, I quote, abandoned all philological scruples. That is, he is not seeking historical truth. In Visconti, the violent agent causing the perennial disease of Volterra is Volterra itself, the environment itself, the crumbling balse, the incessant wind. The circulation of information about Etruscan history was part of a mainstream narration as new excavation campaigns, particularly at Cerveteri and Pirgi near Rome, graced the first pages of newspapers precisely at that time. Just like the Etruscans were slowly resurfacing through new discoveries, the ghost of the extermination of the Jews was slowly appearing in the public discourse after a good decade of relative oblivion. Primo Levi's If This Is a Man was published in 1947, but did not reach that big an audience, and only with the second edition in 1958 started to be becoming the masterpiece that we all know. The Eichmann trial started in 1961, the Nuremberg trial in 1965. So these are the decades of memorialization. The idea of the potential genocide is also linked to the perception of a loss of a direct link with Etruscan culture, particularly for our Western logocentric perspective, the loss of any or most direct written testimony. Bassani indirectly induces us to think that speaking now, or writing now, is necessary to leave some written testimony of the passage on earth and of the terrifying disappearance of people like the Finzi-Contini who don't have a grave or a written epitaph, to foster the difficult yet necessary conversation about the Nazi war camps, still at its early stages in the 60s. In the movie, the secrets of the Luzzati brothers' childhood are in fact written down in a novel by Gianni, which should not be published, remaining unread, unknown, and secret like the memories of the Etruscan peoples. And in fact, the novel that Gianni has drafted ends up burning in a fireplace. Last but not least, both works use the comparison Jews-Etruscans to articulate a critique of some aspects of contemporary Jewish culture. In both cases, Jewish families and communities are portrayed as intent in perpetual self-contemplation, devouring and swallowing themselves in their closure to the external world, exclusivity, and worship. Observed against the Etruscan example, these elements stand out even more effectively. In Bassani, the late Etruscans of Cerveteri, who contemplate the end of their civilization, saying, what does it matter? Content of the safety and self-seclusion of their tombs, or second homes, alongside their forefathers, devoted to the family dead, contains a critique, continued throughout the novel, of the lack of reaction, of responsiveness of the Ferrarese Jewish community to the fascist persecution. In doing so, Bassani raises the issue, the delicate issue, of the co-responsibility of the Jewish community he represents as an Italian Jew in the disaster of the Shoah, a very difficult matter articulated in an extremely nuanced and complex way throughout the novel, throughout the entire oeuvre by Bassani, but also evident in the subtle, sophisticated use of the Etruscan metaphor at the beginning of the novel. In Visconti, the Jewish motif seems to me subordinated to other elements that structure and perhaps overload Sandra. The fact that Emanuele, the father, died in the Shoah, and that Sandra is involved in an investigation about his disappearance at Auschwitz, add elements of tragedy to the tragedy and historical depth to Visconti's story. But I don't really think this is what the movie is about. The movie is about the degeneration of familial bonds and the venom that can ruin within blood relationship. The Etruscan mystery that looms all around the characters, the persistent references to death, loss, oblivion, emphasizes this overarching theme. The Jewishness of the Luzzatis further emphasizes the centrality of the family theme, playing with some classical stereotypes that part of Visconti's audience might well recognize. I'm going to show you two extracts from Visconti's interviews which support my interpretation. This is Visconti talking. I have chosen a half-Jewish family, only the father is Jewish, to give more strength to the familial bonds. I thought, that in people of Jewish race, and that's exactly the word that Visconti uses, razza, the sense of the family, the sense of the clan is much stronger than in any other, let's say, race, again, razza, or religion or blood. The choice, therefore, depends on the fact that the theme, as in other movies of mine, but most strongly here, is that of the disgregation of a family, that is, the betrayal of some member of the family. So as you can see, this extract conveys a rather archaeological view on modern Jews described through perennial traits and characteristics of a tribe, ancestry, or, to use Visconti's term, race. In this sense, the parallel with the Etruscans is useful to evoke these features that frame Jewishness as archaic and eternal, always the same. While Bassani, on the contrary, alludes to the danger for modern Jews to become, in a way, like the Etruscans, silenced and self-marginalized without adequate written representation. On another occasion, Visconti reiterated that the real theme of the movie is Sandra, a character whose transformation is led by moral distress and desire to know more, like in other movies. The Jewishness of Sandra is an apparently secondary matter, which further contributes to characterize her and her family with, I quote, a complex of moral superiority embedded in a racial belonging. The fact that Visconti seems to think racially in this text commentary on Sandra is further confirmed by another passage. Claudia Cardinale, we are told, seems to be perfect for the role because her body bears significant similarities with the facial and cranial features of the Etruscan women as far as we know them. Here, Visconti's language borrows elements not only from the semantic field of racial theory, but also from phrenology and anthropology. Specifically, the idea that the resemblance of facial features, and particularly the Etruscan nose, to the sculptural and pictorial representation of the Etruscans was typical of scientific and perhaps more para-scientific accounts on these themes in the 30s and 40s, when they were used to foster racist narratives, and Marie-Laurent Sac has written eloquently about this. Also, the idea that the Etruscan woman corresponds to one type, one figure, comes from an area of knowledge veined of racialistic elements. So, to just sum up, Visconti's movie is basically a modern version of Electra, which borrows from different domains a series of elements that contribute to modernize and nuance the dark shades of the original story. The fact that the Valde Luzzatto family is half Jewish and the continuous reference to the Etruscans as elements that foster the centrality of the family theme, but do not deviate from it. And these are articulated on a rather stereotypical and outdated, even for the time, view. The movie also doesn't show much intention to develop any discussion on Jewishness, memory, and the trauma of the Shoah. Instead, the prologue to Bassani's novel is a meaningful introduction to the tone and themes of the novel that give the reader a sense of the proportion of the memorial enterprise that the author is about to begin. I'm just going to conclude very quickly by showing you another example of the recurrence of the Jewish Etruscan superimposition by Elie Wiesel, Nobel Prize for Peace and Holocaust survivor. If you have ever seen this horrific image of Auschwitz, this guy here, he is Elie Wiesel. Paroles d'étranger, Words of a Foreigner, is a 1982 collection of short stories. Tale number 5 is entitled L'éternité étrusque. Etruscan eternity. And it's a curious story, probably a story of invention, where the narrator is a professor of Jewish studies, probably an alter ego of Elie Wiesel himself, who meets a mysterious colleague, David Karliner, who is a survivor of the Nazi war camps, during a post-war meeting in an American university. Karliner is an Etruscologist and studies the Etruscan idea of death. He is not willing to talk about his past. He is willing to tell about himself only by speaking of the Etruscans. Julie is David's lover. Tried to get him to talk about his past, but he refused it. She insisted. He refused again. And then finally, Julie has an idea. The Etruscans, she said, tell me about the Etruscans. And David fell into the trap. By describing to her the life and death of the Etruscans, he was awakening his own life, his own death, over there. In French is là-bas, laggiù, down there, another catabasis. The irrational hatred of the Roman attackers, the astonishment of the first meeting, etc., etc. Why such cruelty among the Romans? Why so much resignation among the Etruscans? Again, the same motive by Bassani. Within a week, a month, or a year, the survivors had let themselves be carried away by death. Finally, only once did David allow him to speak, briefly, almost hurriedly, evoke the terrors that always dwelt in him. You see, Julie, there were humans being down there, là-bas, again, too. And this I will never understand. And then he regained control of himself. He locked himself away in his secret, preferring to sing the memory of the men and the women, the Etruscans, young and old, sad or happy, who once in a faraway land, near the Tiber and in the shadow of the implacable Roman enemy, had tried to dream and to celebrate the magic of the word and the eternal value of memory. And this short story ends exactly from where we started. The idea of caring about the Etruscans. Do you remember Giannina who said voglio bene agli Etruschi? Well, the narrator of L'Eternité Etrusque concludes like that. I began to love the Etruscans with a passionate and violent passion. If you want to know more, I will guide a guided tour of Villa Giulia precisely on this talk in a couple of days, giovedì 27 febbraio. Thank you very much.